Okay. You'll have more time in this session.
All right, so good afternoon, I mean, good morning, good afternoon to every part of the country there that is watching. So, finally, we are able to have this awaited annual RegTech Day with our panel here of experts from different organizations and which will walk us thoroughly on the evolvement of RegTech within and beyond the FSI, a public private journey to RegTech 3.0. And this session today is moderated by Mr. Douglas Arner. So, Douglas, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Via. And first, a huge thanks and congratulations to Mona Kuhn, RegPack Revolution, RegTech Black Book, and Change Gap for bringing this event back. I think Deborah's keynote just hit some of the high points, and I think we're going to return to some of those issues. I think in this panel, we're going to look at some of the big picture evolution and trends going forward, particularly on some of the public-private partnership sides, which I think are developing really well, and some new areas for RegTech. And I'm joined by Nirvana Ferdi. Nirvana is board member of 4 different RegTech startups. She's worked in senior roles across the industry and brings with her, I think, a long-term detailed perspective on the evolution of the industry. I'm joined by Chai-Kit Chong. Chai-Kit is the founder of Synopsys, a leading RegTech in Singapore, working across the ecosystem and very active in FinTech Association in Singapore, RegTech associations, etc. We're joined by Deborah Young from the opening keynote, and unfortunately, proving that COVID does indeed remain with us, Joanne Barefoot is not able to join us today, and we hope that Joanne is feeling better soon. Stuck here in Hong Kong, where we still have 1 week hotel quarantine for anyone who arrives. I think that we wish COVID would go away, but it's very much one of those things that almost every day remains with us. I think if we look at RegTech, and I think if anything, I would go even broader than Deborah's definition. I would actually say that RegTech is the use of technology for regulatory compliance, implementation, and monitoring. So I would actually incorporate not only RegTech stricto sensu, which is RegTech use by the industry for compliance purposes, but I would actually go as far as actually incorporating SupTech, supervisory technology, and even digital financial infrastructure. Because as I think Deborah said very well, when we're talking about RegTech, after all, we're talking about regulation, and it's the regulators that are setting the regulations and the reporting requirements. And when we think about RegTech, we can't not think about the regulators, the supervisors, as well as the industry and the technology. And I think that gives us quite a long history. And I think 2008, we had evolution in the context really of digital reporting, risk management. After 2008, a real explosion, both as a result of new post-crisis regulations around the world, but also as a result of major expansion in enforcement in the context, particularly of AML and sanctions. And one could kind of think of those as RegTech 1 and RegTech 2. And kind of the focus of this panel and part of the whole event is this idea of RegTech 3. In other words, where have we gone from that base, and where are we going forward? And so I wanted to turn to Nirvana first and ask, from your perspective, if you're kind of looking back and looking forward at the same time, how would you say that you see the big evolutionary patterns and the trends in RegTech over the past 5 years or so?
Hi, Doug. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me for such a wonderful event, and best wishes to Joanne. I hope she gets well soon. I'm just recovering myself as well, so this is definitely here to stay. In regards to RegTech, well, my experience with it first started, I guess, it's been around in financial services in some shape or form and other industries like pharma for many years now. But when I started my foray, as it were, into RegTech, it was around 2014, 2013, 14, after MIFID II, MIFIR was coming out, and there were the consultation papers, etc., that were being discussed. Having been in financial services for the past 25 years and having gone from the dark to the light, which is the tech sector, or depending on the day, whatever you might want to call it, one could be the light and the other the dark. I was very much hands-on early on in my career from a compliance, operations, or audit type of background, where I was doing things very, very manually. And going back to my point about MIFID and MIFIR, when that came in, as a compliance person, your responsibility suddenly doubled. And, we were already being hit by a tsunami of regulations, within Europe and globally after the financial services collapse, and that was continuously evolving. And it made us, in terms of compliance professionals, hemorrhage a lot of financial cost, and we had a lot of resource burdens, and everything was done in a very tactical and very manual manner. I remember many years ago now, I'm going to show my age, but we were looking at hundreds of thousands of trades with a Excel spreadsheet VLOOKUP. So that's when I kind of decided, with all the new regulations coming in, so many of them coming at the same time, surely there was a better way of making this more efficient for us, more cost effective, take away the resource burdens, and also leverage technology to solve for regulatory problems, for example. And again, Doug, you mentioned what Deborah mentioned in her brilliant keynote, and I'll further expand on that point as to what RegTech is to me. RegTech to me is not just a solution that helps for that. It goes beyond financial services. Is definitely, to me, not a part of fintech, which many people have that misassumption that it is. It goes to any industry that's hit by any type of regulation whatsoever. It's leveraging technology to solve for regulatory problems and helping for that. And also, it goes a bit further for me also in terms of it being a set of principles as well, right? In terms of embedding compliance by design at the development stage of the products. And that will help organizations be more compliant, be more cost efficient, and focus on their core business rather than the regulatory aspect. So that's kind of my take on it. And we've come a long way. I'll wrap it up and let others give their take on it as well. But you also mentioned, what do I see going forward? I really think RegTech is here to stay. I mean, 2012 was when we first started talking about it, and the iterations of it coming out down the line. We had the RegTech Council and the various RegTech bodies that were established, and a lot of the great people on the panel today, such as Deborah and Joanne, who unfortunately isn't here, yourself, and Che, we have all been here from the get-go, watching this thing evolve throughout the years. It's here to stay. And I think in order for us to keep up with the tremendous technical revolution that we're in right now, we're in the fourth industrial revolution, everybody's talked about that, and especially now in light of the global pandemic, where we saw our world go, up in smokes almost overnight, and we all had to suddenly go offline and to the cloud and work remotely and what have you. Technology was what helped us. However, the RegTech and RegTech type solutions are definitely needed now more than ever to help us mitigate risk, so on and so forth. So that's my point around that. I'll stop and let somebody else chime in.
Thanks. That's really fantastic. I think that really highlights some of our big picture trends and evolutions. And I think that point about MIFID, MIFIR actually highlights something else, which is we're now seeing a range of regulators actually enforcing RegTech. If we look at 2019, we see a series of actions from the UK FCA against UBS, against Goldman, against Bank of America, Merrill Lynch, where literally they had errors or failures to report or incorrect reporting of tens of millions of transactions. Now, if you think about a trading desk, there's not some guy who's sitting there with the world's fastest finger doing those trades. And likewise, our traditional idea of someone sitting at the end of the trading desk filling out ticket reports for each of those transactions doesn't happen. And part of the settlements was actually a requirement for the financial institutions to build technological systems to enable them to comply with the regulations. I think that's a huge direction. We'll come back to this COVID point. Jaiket, I think from your standpoint in Asia Pacific, and in particular, if we think about the jurisdictions which have really stepped out from the standpoint of taking a strategic lead, I think the UK, I think Singapore, these are probably the two leading jurisdictions. And from your perspective in APAC, how things looked over the past 5 years?
Thanks, Doug, for the question. And first of all, thanks to Mona and RegTech Revolution for having me on this wonderful truly global RegTech event. And thanks, Deborah, for the very inspiring keynote speech. We'll hear a little bit more from you in this panel as well. Now, my background, very similar to Nirvana here. I've been a compliance officer. I've sort of, if you talk about the RegTech 1.0, 2.0, 3.0, I've sort of lived through this process, from what Nirvana have explained about the manual and analog processes that compliance officer had to go through. I was part of the problem, right? Because I was compliance officer at that time. I was also running the regional function, compliance function for Macquarie Group in Asia for a long time before I founded Synopsys back in 2014. And that's when, to Nirvana's point, RegTech started to get some I would say acknowledgement. If you think about regulatory technologies from not just from Asia Pacific perspective, but more broadly as what you guys were talking about earlier on, I can even distill it down, to the core functional and the purpose of why these technologies or why these systems even exist, because it has always existed way back even in the past. It's the question of whether does the organization that needs to comply, and to Douglas' point about millions of trades that's happening through algorithmic trading and whatnot in the trading desk, the control point that people are building into their systems, if they can build it themselves, will be typically I can split it into the preventive controls as well as the detective controls, right? So it can be built within the banks or the organization's core systems, or if they lack the resources to do so themselves, then that's where the other RegTech solutions providers come into the picture, right? So I think when we talk about RegTech, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to actually buy from someone. Neither does it mean that you have to build it yourself. So there's always a choice. And now with a huge ecosystems across the world of RegTech service providers, the optionalities is massive, and you have a choice. But you do not want to end up with creating a Frankenstein of solution. So, if you try and cobble too many things together, and you can't maintain it in a meaningful way going forward. So you do have to know what you are trying to get out of the whole exercise, not put the technology in front of the problem. You do need to understand what is the problem you're trying to solve, right? What is the control? Are you weak in the preventive control, and therefore you beef up preventive control, but you can't prevent all eventuality, and then therefore you look at creating some way, shape, or forms of detective control to manage the risk that you're undertaking. So in terms of Asia Pacific growth and development of this sector, I think it's been pretty interesting because Doug, you mentioned regulators like in Singapore have been pretty forefront, and at the heart of or the start of COVID back in 2020, the Mass Monetary Authority of Singapore put money, into the problem, by coming up with digital acceleration grant, RegTech grant, to encourage adoption. And I think similarly, Hong Kong, HKMA have also recently come up with a different roadmap for adoption of RegTech, particularly for the banks, but of course this can be extended beyond just the banks itself, but just it being HKMA, therefore the focus at that for that point is on the banks, and rightly so. Creation of the knowledge hub and the roadmap into the next 5 years or so. I think those are great. I would say thought leadership concepts. But more importantly, in terms of moving into the future of RegTech 3.0, and I sort of would echo Deborah's point here, because right now, I think globally we're at RegTech 2.0. Okay, which means that it is a lot of combinations of software as a service, which is what Synopsys sells as well from an AML KYC perspective, and a lot of other people are also doing even different verticals, digital identity and so on and so forth, transaction monitoring, and various aspects of trade reporting and all that. But this is all very standalone, siloed software as a service. Now, to build beyond the present world and looking into the future, and this is actually what it's just coincidental that at Synopsys we're looking at compliance 3.0, right? How to build beyond the present world, and that's actually that's why this session is actually very interesting for me, because this is actually aligned to what I believe very strongly for, because the move into the future, if you talk about Web 3.0, or you talk about metaverses and the various metaverses and transcending between physical world, present world, and the future world, and that obviously necessitate a number of pretty important infrastructure to be put in place, interoperable across the government agencies, be it digital identity, not just at the raw data level, but at the process digital identity level, And on top of that, you look at ESG, and to Deborah's point, absolutely hit on the head of the nail, because I think ESG, the way I look at it, is going to be pretty massive, because right now it is still a good to have. I can make that statement. It's still a good to have in a lot of to a lot of people, and it will very, very soon start to become a must-have. Just like in 20 years ago, we look at AML KYC, it's like a good to have, but now it's a must-have, right? So when you think about things, what's good to have and what must have, and if I look at the way the framework across the world's, organizations like, IPBES, Network for Greening of Finance, Financial Service Systems, for example, and United Nations COP26 and all that, these are all pointing to the same thing as what FATF, Financial Action Task Force, have done, 20, 25, 30 years ago. But there is obviously a great opportunity for this to be, I would say, shortcut, and it will be actually a lot faster than what happened to AML KYC, for example, as a global framework. So which means that the compliance arena in the future cannot be looked at in a siloed, be it AML KYC, be it this or be it ESG. It will have to be looked at collectively, because it all forms the enterprise compliance risk of the organization, or regulatory risk for the organization that they undertake in performing or providing their services. So I think there are some leading thoughts around, like, for example, what MAS is doing in Singapore, pushing the ESG agenda. And I think a few other regulators across the world are also doing the same thing, in a more collaborative manner. So I would say that the public-private collaboration is absolutely crucial. But in what shape or form the solution people will take up those solutions depends on the stage of maturity of their compliance mindset, as well as the resources and the budget that they have, and whether or not there is a fire underneath the chair. If there's a fire underneath the chair, they will obviously be sitting up straight and doing the stuff. But if the regulators is not taking a more serious view on regulatory compliance, be it ESG or whichever area that you want to focus in, then people will take a more laid back approach and wait till, something blows up before, they start to do something. So I think in Asia Pacific, it's different stages depending on, whether the jurisdiction is more developed. But I think the line of travel is consistent across the world.
Yeah, I think that's really good. I think you've got some huge, great points in there. And I want to come next to the sort of trends in public-private collaboration. And then I want to turn to some of these new trends, particularly on the ESG side. But I think one thing that I wanted to pull out of there first was, the COVID impact, I think in the context of RegTech, SupTech, digital financial infrastructure. This whole idea of the RegTech ecosystem has been huge. From the standpoint of financial institutions, the working from home and just the challenge of a trading desk working from home, compliance working from home, regulators working from home. That has been a massive challenge and a massive mindset change, particularly in big financial institutions. And I think the directionality from the standpoint of cloud-based processing is huge. I think from the standpoint of regulators and supervisors, prior to COVID, regulators and supervisors would, even domestically, you might have a conference call with a speaker in the middle of a table, but you would never, ever have a sort of Zoom call or a Teams call or an online meeting. And today, if I'm thinking about both domestic regulatory processes, but as also international processes, regulators have really, it's been just night and day in terms of regulatory attitudes towards use of technology, not least because from the simple standpoint of one of your DOLA supervisory processes, on-site supervision and physical auditing of all of those files that Niv was talking about, that hasn't been able to happen. And so we've had to have a difference. And I think these mindset changes have been huge. And finally, a lot of this has played out in infrastructure, CBDCs, digital ID systems, platforms. And I think that is something that if I'm thinking about RegTech 3.0, a lot of it is about the sort of public-private partnerships collaboration. I wanted to turn back to Deborah on that and say, Deborah, what are you seeing from the standpoint of public-private collaboration in the context of RegTech?
Thanks, Doug. And what I love about being part of these sessions is that I learn as much as hopefully I can contribute. And I couldn't agree more with Chai Kit and Nirvana. And in fact, if we think it started at RegTech 1.0, I actually started RegTech. I'm so old that I started in RegTech 0.0 when all I had to manage the risk at the back office of my bank was a series of red hardcover books. And so the trades were all written up in these books, and that's how we did the settlements. And of course, it was lots of human error. And so when 5 years ago, when the association was founded and I got on this journey, it was amazing to me that my career had done this full circle, and now I could really apply technology other than a book in order to mitigate the many risks. Look, I think in terms of You've just talked about the pandemic, and that has definitely been wind beneath the wings in terms of this collaboration between public and private. I think we've seen a maturing, and certainly it's to the great credit of many people that will be on this call today, including those on the panel, that we have lent in and we are helping this industry mature. So I think we've been seeing a maturity in the industry. The level of transformation that is currently occurring as a result of the pandemic, the increased data flows that are flying around the world now. I mean, when I was a kid and I wanted to make a phone call, I had to go and put a coin into a public phone box. Right now, I actually don't have coins. And actually, all I have to do is ask Siri to make a call for me. I don't even have to touch the phone, and magically she will connect me with somebody that I don't even have to hold the phone in my hand. So when we think about, you know, the sheer transformation that's happened even within my lifetime, you know, we've talked about ESG, you know, that's going to be front and center, and an important part of how we collaborate in the future. I mean, 5 years ago, it was like shouting down and into an empty well of trying to get RegTech moved into a more strategic position from simply one of software sales. And there were dysfunctions 5 years ago. But I think that we have seen an incredible evolution. There's things like the Global Financial Innovation Network. Chai-Kit mentions MAS have been very, very supportive from a regulatory perspective. Our own regulators in Australia have been very proactive on a number of the programs that they're running. They've opened their doors. They're open to a conversation. It used to be really difficult to get a regulator to come and speak about anything, but now I would say within a day or two, I could get a response from a regulator to come and speak at an event, and maybe a data point which will just show you the magnitude. And this isn't so much about my association, but in 2019, we had 1,000 people attend our programs. And since the beginning of the pandemic, to underline the point on bringing people together and how we're going to collaborate, we've had 13,000 people from 75 countries come to our programs. And so that is showing you the magnitude of appetite and interest that there is, and the important role that associations like ours and some others that are on the call, really important, the evolution of these associations and other research and consulting firms that are helping the industry to collaborate will be really, really critical going forward. And being able to do that on a slightly independent basis is also important in building trust with regulators and the government. We've enjoyed that because our association is an independent association. So I think that there's still much work to be done, but I think we're on a good journey right now. And so I think it's all shoulders to the wheel to push this in to 3.0 with very much, I think ESG is going to be top of the pops, and going back to some of the things that Nirvana said earlier, definitely we will see other industry sectors take off and being able to benefit from what RegTech can bring.
Thanks for that, Deborah. And I think a couple of huge things in there. The first, when we think about trends, I think if we're thinking about new areas, you've hit data. Data is one of our biggest emerging areas of new regulations, new compliance challenges, and as a result, RegTech and the cross-border data challenges are just growing. Second, from the standpoint of cybersecurity, this is probably the area where we're seeing the most rapid growth, the biggest risks, some of the biggest spend on tech. And finally, ESG, but also some of the challenges that we're seeing around fragmentation. If I wanted to pick up one of the big trends that I think is going on, it's a move from regulators towards digital regulatory reporting, basically setting digital requirements for how things must be regulated that enable them to collect information in digital form and immediately apply it from the standpoint of analytics. I always joke, if you think about AML. In 2012, pre-FinCEN sort of explosion, there were about 200,000 suspicious transaction reports being filed a year with FinCEN in the US. That's a lot of paper. But after 2012, after BNP, Standard Chartered, Iran, HSBC, it goes to 2 million reports a year. Now, think about if you are FinCEN, what do you do with 2 million pieces of paper that are non-standardized? And that has really driven regulators themselves, as they've driven reporting requirements, to have to develop information systems of their own. Now, I want to turn to our sort of last discussion area, and really this idea of new areas looking forward. And I think, one, the idea of where are we seeing RegTech developing outside of financial services, but I also want to delve into how are we seeing RegTech operating particularly in the ESG context. And Niv, knowing that you're working with a range of firms outside of financial services, maybe I'll turn it to you for what you're seeing in terms of development trends for RegTech outside of finance.
Absolutely. Just to go back slightly on a point that was raised as well with regards to what you mentioned around the regulators, it's so important to understand that as the regulations come out and the policies are written, these regulators are in a position where they have to take that data in, ingest the data, and understand it. So they didn't have the capability. So RegTech is something that absolutely not only helps the regulator, but also helps the industry. That's one point. The other point is collaboration is key. This is not something that just one person can do. I remember back in the day when they were having, I've worked with many regulators globally and helped advise on regulations back in the day when they were doing, for example, consultations on some of the regulations that were coming out. I was a consultant myself. They would not allow consultancy firms to come and attend those hearings. Now, we advised their members, so we were not privy to that information or what was being discussed, but that has evolved tremendously. So the regulator is also a stakeholder at the table, and they need to understand the technology and get their heads around it. And that will help them inform their policies better. Now, to going back to the question you actually asked me about where we're going, I work with various organizations. Obviously, my role at Hitachi, I was the head of RegTech, and I owned that business for them. And we had various different sectors, such as telco, oil and gas, media and entertainment, all of these, and healthcare, of course, and the Fed sector of the organization. All of these sectors and verticals had regulatory requirements. So the beauty of RegTech is not in that, the beauty of it lies here is that it is transferable and it can be applied to other industries and sectors. And we should take an example. I mean, I think in financial services, it's really matured over the years. But in other sectors, for example, in the oil and gas sector or telco, media and entertainment, in those kind of areas, even real estate, they can take the example of financial services and apply that. And I think the key is when we are working with different sectors, a lot of them are less mature than financial services, obviously, and still have such archaic technology in place, dinosaur behemoth systems that have been in place, and the infrastructure is just so old, and lots of legacy systems. We still see that in financial services. So when you go to a sector that's less mature, for example, like oil and gas, it's ridiculous. The challenges there are tremendous. But I think slowly, as I would like to say, I hate the word, but it's the only one that comes to mind, evangelizing regtech. It's our responsibility to do that. I believe it was in your opening keynote, Deborah, that you mentioned, that the average Joe Blog in the street, and forgive me, I'm butchering what you said, but doesn't need to be aware of RegTech. But I 100% agree with you that it's our responsibility to protect the consumer by the use of regulatory technology that can help solve for these things and really embed compliance by design at the development stage. If we think of it from the get-go like that, in any sector, if you look at, for example, healthcare and pharma, or biotech, they have technology in place that has to differentiate with regards to what the regulation is, and it's applied there already. It's critical, and I say this half jokingly, but honestly, we have, as technologists and industry practitioners, we have a responsibility. And I always say, anyone who deals with data, deals with technology, needs to take a Hippocratic oath like doctors do, harm none. I think it's so important. So, that's my view on it. I think certainly going forward, it will be everywhere. We need to not only get rid of legacy systems, but legacy thinking. We are moving leaps and bounds. I mean, 10 years ago, my job wasn't even a twinkling anybody's eye, right? And now we have, head of RegTech, head of innovation, head of this, head of that. And, there's new roles and jobs evolving, and it's only going to get bigger and faster. So it's important we take that legacy mentality away and really get with the program. I get so tired of hearing, going to meetings, people saying to me, what's the market opportunity for RegTech? It's just like, come on, smell the coffee. Anyway, that's my two cents on it.
No, I think huge points there. And, I think one is this idea about RegTech everywhere. And it's something that I think COVID has really done. And in Hong Kong, to do literally anything, I have to scan an app on my phone. And that's RegTech. I am complying with regulations. I am using technology. The government is using that from the standpoint of supervision. That is supervisory technology. That information is being used for all sorts of purposes, health monitoring, et cetera. That is RegTech. And basically what it is it's impacting everybody constantly. And just one little point, because I always do this. And I think the numbers are something where often numbers focus in on the startup side. Often, I think it's really important to focus on the big picture. And if we look at enforcement spending, penalties by financial services since 2008, it's almost $400 billion in fines paid globally. That's point one. Point two is if we look at how much does the financial services industry, and I know we're talking about more than financial services, but how much does financial services spend on tech? And each year, it's around $500 to $600 billion globally. Now, getting exact figures for how much financial services spends on compliance is a little bit more difficult. But the estimates are somewhere between 300 and 700 billion a year, with 40% of that on tech. And therefore, when you think about the opportunity, you are actually talking about hundreds of billions of dollars that is already being spent just by financial services on technology for compliance purposes. And I think that is huge. Now, sorry about that, Chai Kit. Let me turn to you for the same question. What do you see from the standpoint of your business? Where are the opportunities? Where's the growth?
No problem, Doug. I think that those are great big numbers that you put out there that sort of validate the reason why we're in this business, because oftentimes you look at research papers and numbers and all the market opportunity you look at, only typically it will focus on what, like you said, the big banks fines and the spends. Nobody actually go down and ask the mass long tail of the market about how much they spend. And if you sort of add those up, you probably can double or triple up the actual amount of money people actually spend on trying to comply with prevailing regulation or trying to catch up with regulations that is coming their way. So I think in terms of the trends, and in terms of what is likely to occur, I think there are two parts, and I would sort of also echo a little bit about what Nirvana have mentioned earlier on in terms of the collaborations, as well as the absolute need for people to actually get on top of this I would say the bandwagon in a good way, the journey in terms of adopting technology, because in where we play in the AML KYC space, as we know, it itself as a regulatory requirement goes beyond financial services and banks, right? So which means that the applications of the implementation of the AML KYC rules have now extended globally into people like in the we call it the DNFBP sector, the designated non-financial business and professions. So that's one area. If you think about it, AML KYC as a problem statement, it's not a problem that only affects the banks or the financial institutions or even the fintechs. It actually extends beyond outside of financial services. So who are the designated non-financial business and professions? You've got your corporate secretaries, your accountants, your lawyers, your real estate agents, your precious stones metals dealers, and your casinos and your gaming sector. And quite frankly, the blurring of the lines, in terms of crypto players, the blockchain players, the NFT platforms, the play to earn, the gaming sector, makes it creates a big shades of grays, which means that the regulatory requirements, even on the topic of AML KYC, is still being debated about who gets covered and who doesn't get covered at the moment. So if you follow the line of travel on the regulatory, I would say in this topic of AML KYC, the application have always been with the financial sector. That's a given, and fintech players and all that stuff. But then, a few years ago, when cryptocurrency started to evolve, some of the players were saying, okay, we're not covered because we're not regulated. But now you can see that across some of the more mature jurisdictions, the regulatory reach have already hit them. So once they're being regulated, then AML KYC comes into the picture. They are brought into the space. So you have now one area of contentious, even in the crypto space, like the NFT platforms, for example. Are those regulated or not regulated? If they are transacting, if you're offering an intermediation platform, to bring buyers and seller together, then you're kind of operating like in my view, like a pseudo financial service, one way, shape, or form. And then you can say, okay, I don't really care because I'm not regulated, therefore I don't need to know who's the buyer and seller. I'm just operating a platform. But ultimately, nobody regulates the technology. People regulate the activities that you carry out with the technology that you offer, right? Be it a platform or otherwise. And you cannot send the platform or the developers to jail, or the people who writes the algorithm. It's actually the people who actually use the platform or the technology to gain perhaps a benefit or a fee, for the services that they offer. Typically, that's how it will work in a civilized law and order society. Okay, so that means the application is actually very broad, and I suppose it's above all our pay grades here, in terms of whether or not which other sector potentially can benefit from the applications of RegTech. Certainly, like Nerf and I think Deb has already mentioned, sectors outside of financial services, including telcos, pharmaceutical, and biotech, and all that is a given. But in the space of a KYC AML, where I play, it's actually already out there into various sectors globally. Now, as I mentioned, it's really where and how strong the fire underneath the chair is at the moment for each jurisdiction who's implementing these requirements. If the regulator's taking a bit of a backseat, then sure, people can go around doing the regulatory arbitrage, by not by trying skirt around around the problem. But I believe regulation will catch up, and hopefully, if there is better public collaboration, that means government to government, regulator to regulator collaboration, you can slowly close the regulatory arbitrage gap, and therefore it will probably be more uniform and a little bit more, I think the word is a safer environment for everybody.
Absolutely. And I think, one of some of the more interesting discussions we're seeing around some of the platforms right now is this idea of embedded regulation, embedded supervision. In other words, build the actual regulatory and disclosure requirements,
Yep.
the behavioral monitoring systems directly into your DeFi systems, which actually highlights something, I think, at the very beginning, which is that when we think about RegTech, when we think about regulation, we're not doing this just to make life more expensive. We're actually doing it to make the markets work better so that everybody can benefit. Now, we're coming right to the end, and what I just want to do is just 1 minute for everybody in terms of looking forward. What do you see? Big trend, big opportunity over the next 3 to 5 years. So, Deborah, we'll come back to you because you started us out on this journey.
Thanks, Doug. So I think, and the thoughts have been echoed around the panel. I think this is all about people and safeguarding consumers, and we should keep that top of mind. Think about what the data can do for you and having access to transparent data. I think welcoming new kids on the block in terms of RegTech. The doors of our association are open to new ideas and new applications for RegTech, and we've recently come across those with something called Workforce Management Solutions, which is an opportunity for RegTech to have application across the small, medium and large business community on how you onboard your employees, how you make sure that you're paying them properly, how you make sure that you're deducting the right tax and the right pension fund information, right through to how you develop them professionally along their life cycle as an employee, and then how you offboard them safely and securely. So I think that this is an exciting time for RegTech, really, really exciting time for RegTech. And I, for one, am watching and learning over the next little while to see what transpires.
Thanks, Deborah. Chaiket.
I think, as I've said earlier on, into the future, gazing into the crystal ball, the future of RegTech 3.0 will move beyond just very, very siloed little pieces of softwares on their own, whereby it will move into a platform centric type of an environment, ecosystem that has got huge collaboration between the private and the public side. And so, typically the private side will not be building the big ecosystem infrastructure. So the infrastructure layer will definitely be driven by the public side, and the private side will actually build on top of that, hopefully to grow that that collaboration. So that will be key. And in terms of the trends of the future on where things will come closer together, the blurring of the lines between what happens in our physical world today and what happens in the virtual world tomorrow, virtual world including the Web3, the DeFi, the metaverses of the like, because ultimately it's still the person, human, like Chaikit, controlling the avatars and doing whatever else that you do in these different metaverses or virtual worlds, right? So that person have to be responsible for what action he or she takes, in any parts of the platforms or the infrastructure. Now, that will also mean that trusted, processed, interoperable digital identity is actually very crucial to the success of this new digital economy that everybody is talking about. And secondly, because we talk about ESG as well, in order for ESG to actually take greater shape and not have greenwashing and whatever not, it's not just going to affect the 8,000 biggest company in the world to do their little disclosures. It has to involve the 250 million companies in the world, the long tail segment of the market, as well as it should also include the 7.9 billion people of the world like you and me, that may want to have a say in whether or not this company should actually be rated as ESG compliance or not. There got to be that democratization of the voice and the power. And last but not least, the digital footprint and social media will be key element for us to actually assess and determine, the distinguish between the good, the bad, and the ugly. Because if you look at AML KYC alone, typically screening database looks at 3 million people or profiles that they typically check. Sanction. Sanction is even a more small percentage of the people that is being tracked. Now we have 7.9 billion people in the world. Digital footprint and digital life identity is obviously getting a lot of traction, and therefore the social media presence will be a key element of the data point that Deborah has also mentioned previously. So I think those will be the key trends that I think everyone should be looking out for.
Yeah, I think you've nailed it. Niv, last word is yours.
Well, I think both Deborah and Chai Kit nailed it, so there isn't much for me to add other than to say that RegTech is here to stay. It impacts every sector. It has to be looked at holistically, and we are going to have so many new entrants coming in, and we need to have that holistic view because everything is so much in silos right now. So it's critical that we keep an open mind. More investment is put into it. People are educated from a board level at the top down in terms of what RegTech is and how it can help, because I think it's here to stay and it will be an incredible help to everyone.
Niv, Chai Kit, Deborah, thanks for that. Really enjoyed seeing you all. Great conversation. And thanks to Mona and the team for letting us all talk. Back to you.
Thank you so much.
Just to say, that's wrapping up for this panel and back to the main session.